Well, welcome to the podcast of Multifaith Matters. My guest today is Paul Metzger, and I'm going to read, even though I've known Paul for a number of years, I'm going to go ahead and read his bio here that I got off the internet. Paul Louis Metzger is the founder and director of the Institute for Cultural Engagement, New Wine, New Wineskins, a professor of Christian theology and theology of culture at Multnomah University and Seminary. Dr. Metzger is also the editor of New Wine's journal, Cultural Encounters, a journal for the theology of culture. Integrating theology and spirituality with cultural sensitivity stands at the center of Dr. Metzger's ministry vision. It's always a little bizarre to read a bio like that and introduce and invite somebody formally to a podcast that I know and have worked with for a number of years. But Paul, welcome to Multifaith Matters.
It's great to be with you, John. I always enjoy our conversations.
Paul, what I want to do today is we're going to have a brief conversation. There's two facets to what you do. There's the academic side and the more popular. I don't like calling it practical because I think academics can be practical as well. We'll start with the academic side. You straddle these two worlds, the academic and the popular, and you've written a number of books from this academic perspective. And you don't just deal with multi-faith engagement, but that's what we want to talk about in this podcast conversation. Two of your books that are related to this are Connecting Christ and Evangelical Zen. Can you talk about why you chose to write these particular books and why you chose to write them the way that you did?
Thank you, John. Great questions. And so I'll just start out by saying that what I'm about is what I have termed, and also the New Wine, New Wineskins Institute that I direct has termed, a relational incarnational model of cultural engagement. And that pertains also to what you and I call multi-faith engagement or interaction. And just to set that forth, I'll say that there is a worldview orientation, there's a market-driven orientation, so a worldview dominant orientation, a market-driven orientation, and what I refer to as a relational incarnational model. And so if you will allow me, I'll just unpack that for a few minutes. And I talk about this in the book, Connecting Christ, How to Discuss Jesus in a World of Diverse Paths. I certainly have a quote-unquote Christian worldview, but I think that what is needed in our cultural engagement today is to go deeper than worldview, because people are wired more than just simply their reason and their volition. We have to account for passion as well, what you and I refer to as orthopathy for Christian thought. But people are complex. We all know that. And I think that a lot of times when we engage people of other paths, we frame our conversations with them by way of doctrine. And I'm a professor of doctrine, so I'm all for doctrine. But people are more than their doctrinal assessments and articulations. And you have a book coming out on this subject that we need to deal with: passion, affections, orthopathy, right, and then pathy or passions, right passions. So relational incarnational involves engaging the whole person. So I have a Christian worldview, but it's got to go deeper than that because people are even more complex than their worldviews. Then I'll share some of the concerns I have with the way in which worldview is often framed in terms of other religious traditions or faith traditions. And I think that's a question that you're going to ask me about later. And then there's market-driven, where we engage people based on, target audience or based on what the cultural dynamics are in terms of people's preferences and their appetites by way of, consumer products. And I never want to look at engaging people simply by way of what appeals or simply appetites, affections, yes, and orthopathy, right affections, but not simply like demographics or the matter of cultural preferences and we want to engage people based on truth, which is what worldview is trying to get at, and then also what market approaches to cultural engagement are about is contextualization. We're for contextualization at New Wine, but it's got to be based on truth, just as worldview has to be based on grace. And so relational incarnational model engages people in terms of their wiring for relationship. As Floyd McClung of YWAM said, people don't care how much you know until they know how much you care. And so I think that's incredibly important. And then incarnational, it's not a warm, fuzzy kind of relationship. I've been influenced by theologians like Karl Barth and Dietrich Bonhoeffer, and You definitely see this with Bonhoeffer, the matter of a kind of cruciform Christian faith, where it's going to be costly to us. If we live in the footsteps of Jesus, we really have to live into that costly Christianity. Someone like Martin Luther King Jr., how he engaged people, not by way of tolerance only, because tolerance can, if not rightly circumscribed, lead to indifference. It's got to be tenacious love. And I think that's what the Christian faith calls us to, a relational, incarnational model where we participate in Christ's incarnate life. And so that's what I'm trying to do in everything I'm about. No doubt I fail miserably at times, but those are my ideals, the relational and incarnational model. And it pertains to how I engage in terms of these books that you've alluded to, namely Connecting Christ and Evangelical Zen. Should I just specify a little bit more about those two books,
Sure, yeah.
Or is that beyond the purview?
No, that's fine.
Okay, so in Connecting Christ, I do present how I see things as a Christian theologian, as a Christian apologist, engaging other faith traditions or other traditions, including secular humanist or atheist. Not to say that those are always the same, but I'm engaging more broadly. I engage paganism, or neo-paganism, depending on how one frames that. The Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, Unitarian Universalism, Buddhism, Hinduism, Islam, the Jewish tradition, and the like. And so in that book, I present my relational incarnational model, allowing for or drawing from what I had just articulated to you a few minutes ago. And then besides presenting on those traditions, I also allow and seek out those traditions to respond to me. And I give them the last word, so to speak. I don't think if we're operating dialogically, we have to have the last word. I think for one, as Christians, we need to trust God's Spirit more. I certainly need to trust God's Spirit more. And I don't think I have to have the last word. And, I think I need to allow for that exchange where they can push back and challenge me because of my own limited perspective on their traditions. But that's bound up with the relationship. And I think listening is a form of love. And that includes me engaging them where I want to hear from them and not just second order statements by fellow Christians like myself. Engage in them. That's important. But first and foremost, we need to hear from them. And I think that's important if we're to establish trust, even while holding firmly to our distinctives as Christians. In Evangelical Zen, I wrote that book with someone who is a good friend of yours and mine, the Abbot Kyogen Carlson, a Zen Buddhist priest. His last interview, as far as I understand, was with you and me for the Foundation for Religious Diplomacy. He passed away a few years ago quite suddenly of a massive heart attack, and that's still devastating to me. He was one of my closest friends like you are, and just his profundity of his life, it still speaks to me. And so we did this book together, which was really a combination of Robert Pirsig's Zen and the Art of Motorcycle Maintenance meets Augustine's Confessions. And it was basically a 40-day travel log, spiritual travel log of mine in Japan, where my wife is from. And then he presented the foreword, offered the foreword, and responses to each of my musings, my reflections, my spiritual journey reflections in that book. And it certainly strengthened the book to have his perspective as an American Zen Buddhist priest, reflecting on my time with Zen Buddhism and other thought forms in Japanese dress, so to speak.
Well, they're both excellent books, and what I see you doing is bringing the best as an academic, but also using this incarnational relational kind of approach. And it's unfortunately there isn't as much as I think we need in the evangelical world of this kind of thing. Now, you mentioned a template that you find a lot of times in evangelical work when it comes to other religions, kind of a doctrinal contrast. Here's Christian doctrine, here are the Bible verses, this is what they believe, and then it usually includes an apologetic refutation. Here's why what they believe isn't biblical, and therefore they're a false religion, cult, what have you. What motivations, what's your reasoning? Why do you follow a different approach? You told us what that approach is, but why do you follow something different?
Well, certainly, first off, when we talk about the importance of doctrine, as I said before, I'm a theologian, I'm a professor of doctrine, and like you as an evangelical, we both seek to maintain a real robust and adhere to a real robust presentation of the Christian faith. Both you and I would affirm Paul's teaching in 1 Timothy 4:16 to Timothy when he says, watch your life and doctrine closely, because if you do, you will save both yourself and your hearers. So that's something that's a given to me. And so I certainly appreciate and value bringing doctrine to bear. Something that I have said in many contexts, perhaps in Connecting Christ and in Evangelical Zen, but in a book I co-edited, A World for All, we need to go through our convictions as evangelicals, and that's what multi-faith is about. It's, engaging them, your language and others, as trusted rivals. We go through our convictions, not around them. Liberal Christians tend to go around their convictions. Fundamentalist Christians tend to stop short at their convictions. We need to go through, not around or stop short. And what I try and do is go through my convictions to engage the other, not around, as maybe a more liberal form of Christianity would go to find neutral ground. I don't believe in neutral ground. I believe in shared public space, but I don't think it's neutral. I don't believe in a naked public square, but a very clothed public square, as we engage people from various traditions together, bringing the best of our traditions and accounting for the worst of our traditions. Fundamentalist Christians often, unless you believe what I believe, there's no dialogue. You convert and then I'll engage. So I don't believe in stopping short and holding off on conversation until they convert, if you will, or going around our convictions, but rather going through. And I should say, too, I should just add, and this will take me further into the answer to the question, I think so often we've been accused, and rightly accused, of being bait and switch with our orientation. As I just said a minute ago, won't have the dialogue until you convert. Certainly, I want everyone to come to know Jesus in a personal, life-giving, saving way. But I would hope that I'm always desirous of connection with people of other traditions, regardless of whether they ever come to faith in Jesus Christ. And if I don't, it's not really relational. It's just a surface level relationality, which is just bait and switch. And so that's always a barometer for me. Will I continue the connection with them regardless of where they come from or where they go in terms of their faith tradition? So more to the point, more directly to the question's answer, having said that, I really affirm the need for doctrine and worldview, but I think it has to go deeper and beyond to account for the complexities. One of those complexities is a lot of faith traditions do not look at themselves ultimately by way of doctrine. I think the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints and many others, for example, while they do have a worldview, so to speak, while they do have doctrines, I mean, they have a book, Doctrine of the Covenants, but they are framed more by way of ritual, by way of story, by way of community, such as family, and beyond. And a book on Judaism, titled Judaism, Oxford Press, the author said, so often comparative religion analysis, which comes out of a Christian context, frames other traditions like Judaism by way of doctrine. But Judaism is a way of life, he argues, and so it's not appropriate to simply limit discussion to those types of themes. We have to have an expansive orientation. So I think even with the best of intentions, so often worldview models fall short of really engaging traditions really where they're at. And if we're really relational, we're going to try and engage people where they're at, even if we don't want it to end there, and engage people in terms of pointing the way to Jesus. Jesus is more than a doctrine. He's a person. I said doctrine matters, but it doesn't get at all that makes us essentially human, and not even all of what the scriptures are about. So we could go into that further, John, but that's one aspect of it. The other aspect, and it's more disconcerting to me, is that I think so often in our tradition, there can be power dynamics at work, even with our emphasis on worldview. Molly Worthen, in her book on Apostles of Reason, is really addressing apologetics and other dynamics in the evangelical tradition. And while Kant was the author of the terminology, Immanuel Kant was the author of the terminology Weltanschauung, really in the 20th century, she gets at how in continental Europe, in reaction to Hitler, that term of Weltanschauung, or what we call worldview, took on more and more significance as a counter to Hitler. in her work I'm talking about. Hitler talked about the Christian worldview was weak, and his National Socialism or Nazi worldview was quite robust and strong. So in reaction to Hitler, which it's good to react to, but in reaction to Hitler, there was an attempt on the part often of Reformed theology and others to develop a robust, powerful worldview. Now, I think it all depends on what one means by that, but so often I have found, and it's been my experience, that worldview can be a shutdown orientation. Like you had said before, they're wrong, we're right, it falls short in terms of biblical truthfulness, it's a false religion. And we have these kinds of column analyses of faith traditions. I like to call them faith traditions more than religions, because historically, while we say, God cares for religion, biblical religion is to care for the orphan and widow in their distress. These are more ways of life. Christian faith is even more a way of life than it is a religion, like set propositions. It's a way of life that includes doctrine, but much more. And so in answer to that question, I would go on to say that so often these books that emphasize more columns, here's Christianity, here's Judaism, here's Islam, here's Buddhism, here's what they stand for, it's a straitjacket approach. It doesn't account for them and their depths. And they look at them, they go, that's not us. And it's like taking statements out of context. It's a very reductionistic approach. Now, it's not to say people mean it that way, but I think we're often not aware of our subconscious, myself included, subconscious dimensions. And I do think power dynamics are very much at work in evangelical Christianity and how we engage other traditions, often a fear of the other, a suspicion, in part because of our moral intuition drives. But there's also a threat that they might take over America and further reduce the space of Christian America. So I think a relational incarnational model is a better approach forward, because if you don't want to get the defense mechanisms of people up from other traditions, the thing you don't want to do is frame conversations in a way that straitjackets them, that limits them, that actually comes at them from a position of power and fear, because that's not going to open up for relationship. We talk about relationship a lot, but often the way we engage people of other faith traditions is very non-relational. And I have a long way to go in that direction, and I think we as a movement, the evangelical Christian movement in North America, has a long way to go.
A lot of what you said kind of sets the stage for shifting gears a little bit. Not only are you doing this academic work as a scholar, you're also doing work. You're not just talking about other religious traditions and writing about them, you're interacting with them. And one of the ways you've been doing that for a number of years is relationships with the local Buddhist community, having a series of potlucks. Can you summarize what that's about, how it came about, and what's going on with that?
Well, I had mentioned Abbot Carlson previously, and Abbot Kyogen Carlson was co-abbot with his wife, who's still alive, Gyokoko Carlson. She's retired now, but still there, present at Dharma Rain Zen Center. Together, they were the abbots of Dharma Rain for many, many years in Portland, Oregon. And he and I had met at a group of meetings. It was a consultation put on by a national organization. It was in response to the fatal shooting of an African-American woman, Kendra James, in Portland by a white police officer. And it was an outcry in the city from the African-American community, a lot of tensions. And so this national organization came in, it was a grant, and they helped foster dialogues involving the police union, police officers, religious leaders from various traditions, people of different ethnic backgrounds, to try and foster understanding, civility, dialogue, and get at the issues. And though Abbot Carlson is a Zen Buddhist priest and myself as an evangelical Christian were metaphysically many worlds apart in the minds of many, nonetheless, he and I had a very overlapping kind of approach to how we engaged the religious other. And that showed up in the dialogues where the moderator was saying, let's leave our own convictions at the table or at the door and let's find neutral ground. And neither he nor I thought that was a good way to go. We weren't nasty about it, but we were of the mindset we need to bring our convictions to the door. And so that stood out to both of us. I went off to the East Coast to do some research for several months at the Center of Theological Inquiry in Princeton. And during that time, there was a lot of tension developing in Multnomah County, where Multnomah University is and where Dharma Reign Zen Center is. And during that time, there was a lot of tension over gay marriage. Then President Bush won re-election. There was a ballot measure in the state of Oregon about gay marriage, about orientation should be just between for who's married, a male and a female. And so that was debated. It was put forth, and basically the political drive went in favor with conservatives, both in the state of Oregon and in the nation as a whole, with President Bush's re-election and what was desired by the LGBTQ plus community not going the way that they had hoped. And that increased the tensions, culture war tensions that have always been strong in places like Portland. And Abbott Carlson saw that in his own community. They were very upset about evangelical Christianity and our role in those elections, as statistics showed in 2004. So he reached out to me around the time I came back and said, would you come to my temple to speak on compassion from an evangelical Christian perspective? One of his parishioners had said, if these evangelicals don't change their tune, I'm going to take matters into my own hands and do something about it. That didn't seem so in keeping with Zen Buddhism, with its peaceful, nonviolent orientation, so to speak. So he said, there's a need for us to cultivate understanding, civility. Come with your own convictions, Paul. Share from your tradition about compassion. We'll have a dialogue over a potluck. And that's what started it all. And that was in 2005, I believe, when we first started having these potlucks. And it was so beautiful because here he was, part of a minority or a marginalized religious tradition, however you want to look at it, reaching out to someone who represented more of a dominant cultural tradition in America at large, maybe not Portland, but in America at large. That was risky. Even in his own community, it was risky for him to do that. Because it's like, we can't get away from these evangelicals in the public square. Now you're bringing one of them into our temple. And but he asked me to speak, and so I drew from Scripture. I drew from the story of the Samaritan of Extraordinary Mercy in Luke 10, and also Dr. John M. Perkins' life story and Dietrich Bonhoeffer's. And when I got done, a former Christian who was a Buddhist disciple said to me, based on what they took to be compelling stories of compassion in my faith tradition, if anyone has a corner on compassion, this man said, who had an understanding of Christian faith, coming from Christian faith, though now a Buddhist, he said, if anyone has a corner on compassion, it should be you evangelicals with your belief that God came down from heaven to identify with us in our brokenness. What happened? What happened? And that really stood out to me and to many in the room. It still stands out to me. And that started these conversations of building trust and understanding, not renouncing our convictions, but going through our convictions, not around, not stopping short, and over potlucks. And potlucks were interesting and important because it wasn't a platform. It wasn't a power dynamic. Everyone brings something to share. And that tends to ease the tension right off the bat when you're sharing something you love with someone, a cherished dish from the family or what have you, and you're sharing it together at a table in a dialogue. And we've been doing that. We have one this Friday. And just so grateful for these two communities continuing to stay in it, though our traditions are worlds apart so often. It's important in honor of Christ, in honor of their tradition, honor of our tradition, and also fostering civility in the public square. Just one anecdote, a humorous anecdote. The night that we first did that, Sally Tisdale, a well-known author, she did an article for Tricycle, a Buddhist Review, on our dialogues. And it was the statement there that really stands out to me. Evangelical and Buddhist talking to one another. You like noodle salad? The night of the potluck. You like noodle salad? We like noodle salad. I mean, they couldn't believe it, that, that's something we had in common. And I think we have more in common than that. But we were even surprised that we both like noodle salad. It's like, surely we can't like the same food because we're so opposed to one another in so many ways. So,
how many years has that been going on, Paul?
Well, we had a couple of years where it was more just a small group of us interacting, Kyogen and myself. But on the whole, since 2005, with a few years off, and then we rebooted for these dialogues with the grant we had from Luce and Luce Foundation through the Association for Theological Schools, and I've just really been keeping it going since then and hoping to continue to foster that. It's life-giving to me.
Yeah. One final question for you, Paul. How is your different approach, your work as an academic, as a scholar, and this relationship building with Buddhists, how have these things shaped you as a disciple of Christ?
Well, I think for one, and you and I have talked about this at length, about holy envy and holy jealousy. It was Christo Stendhal at Harvard who talked about that in his engagement of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, all the criticisms, that we should have a holy envy of other traditions. And I'd say also holy jealousy for our own tradition of holding true to what we see as true in our faith tradition, according to Scripture. So I think, for one, my Zen Buddhist friends and others, many others from other traditions, teach me things that I sometimes fail to see in my own tradition. Like, for example, I've often reflected upon the non-grasping way. For Buddhists, Zen Buddhists, they talk about living life with an empty hand. Now, how they go about it metaphysically, what leads to that, what comes from that, is going to be very different from Christian faith. But I think to trust in God's providence requires that I do not approach life in a grasping way, but with an open hand. And so often in life, I live with a clenched fist, not an open hand. And so they teach me, and I'm thinking, if these Zen Buddhists who don't share our traditions, ultimate regard for Jesus Christ, have this profound life bound up with a non-grasping way that goes all the way back to Gautama Buddha, surely I would see, one, as Arthur Holmes at Wheaton said, there's all truth is God's truth, that I can see truth there, and it reminds me of things that I've even forgotten in my own tradition, and it causes me to be more jealous, hopefully in a godly way, to hold true to that trusting in God in a non-grasping way. So I think that is part of it. I think also just they push me to reflect at greater length on what it means to be human. Certainly as an evangelical Christian, as someone who seeks to be an Orthodox Christian, there are some givens for me. There are some non-negotiables for me in terms of the lordship of Jesus Christ, salvation through faith in Jesus Christ. The scriptures are ultimate, Christian scriptures are ultimate written authority. But they still push me, not only to take seriously my own faith tradition, but also to take seriously profound humanity that I see in the world at large. Again, all truth is God's truth. If all people are created in the image of God and have inherent dignity and worth, which our founding documents in this country get at, and I think the biblical doctrine of the image of God gets at, surely I shouldn't be surprised to find truth in these other traditions. And if I think all I can find is error, it probably says that there's a lot of hubris in me and a lack of humility, because I don't get to set the terms of debate. Ultimately, God does. I don't want to be the stumbling block. I want Jesus to be the stumbling block. And so often I stumble over affirming people's humanity. And there needs to be a more rigorous regard for hospitality on the part of evangelicals, myself included. They teach me even on that, how to be hospitable. It was they who reached out to us. And so I think sharing life with them, sensing their profound humanity, they reminding me of truths that I often have failed to account for sufficiently, and just learning how to contextualize my faith in a multi-faith society. Whether we admit to it or not, it's not only coming, it's here. We live in a multi-faith world, and I think so often in our circles we deny that reality is present. My chaplain students working in hospitals, the military, hospice care, prisons, they're already doing this work. They have to engage well. And these things are not given for these people, what we hold dear. I need to navigate like the Apostle Paul on Mars Hill, who engaged with civility, but deep, deep biblical convictions as well, as he engaged the classic pagans on Mars Hill in a way that didn't sacrifice his ultimate truth claims, because he still bore witness to Jesus Christ there with the resurrection of Jesus Christ from the dead, while still affirming them in terms of their poem to Zeus as something he said is speaking to this unknown God whom he's there to tell them about. Paul was far ahead of us in the first century, and we need to be desirous of being world Christians, not worldly Christians or otherworldly Christians, but world Christians, in the 21st century, similar to what Paul was like in the first century?
Well, I should have said in the introduction that I've had the privilege the last 5 years of working with you on a grant from the Louisville Institute, and you're a part of the Multifaith Matters leadership team. And it's a privilege to work with you as a colleague and to have you as a friend. We'll include some links to New Wine, New Wineskins and the 2 books that we mentioned that will accompany the text of this podcast. But Paul, thank you for taking time out of a very busy schedule to have this conversation.
Well, and John, thank you very much. Your friendship means the world to me, and just your insights into these matters, your leadership at FRD, Foundation for Religious Diplomacy, and also the Multi-Faith Matters work. You're really a pioneer in this regard, and I'm grateful to be a colleague of yours.
Thanks again, Paul.